Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who's joining today's STR virtual symposium on strategy meets information systems. We'll just be admitting all of the guests from the waiting room, and then we'll be getting ready to go in a minute or two. The panelists today, we're delighted to welcome a very esteemed set of panelists. We expect to hear from Sofia Bapna. We've got Chris Forman, Shane Greenstein, and Tobias Kretschmer and Milan Miric all joining us today. The theme of today is quite an ambitious question that we've posed to panelists. Is digital convergence leading to scholarly convergence? What does this mean for the relative fields of strategy and information systems? I should introduce myself. I'm David Clough at the University of British Columbia, and I've co-organized this session with Florence Honore at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I would love to now just turn things over to our first panelist for today. I will just mention we'll be keeping an eye on the chat. So if you have questions for our panelists, please feel free to drop those in the chat. And when we have moments to maybe drop a question to the panelists, we'll read those out. We do expect to group together some Q&A and discussion at the end of, after hearing from each of our panelists. Chris, if you would like to queue up your slides, and then we can turn it over to you. Chris Forman.
So so hopefully you can see everything okay. If not, please give me a shout. So thanks so much for allowing me to be part of this. So I mean, to kick off, there's obviously a lot of convergence between strategy and IS scholars on topics and settings, including digital platforms, online communities, which of course are kind of platform, adoption of implications of IT investments at different levels of analysis, market, society, firms, and so forth. And of course, a lot of this has been, recently informed by the implications of AI, which many of us are working on now as well. This is a statement about convergence in topics. I'm going to talk less about convergence in topics and more about convergence within topics, so to speak. And so one area that IS and strategy scholars have been working on for a long time are sort of, trying to understand the implications of IT investments for IT using firms. And so, strategy scholars might take a perspective of value creation and value capture, whereas IS scholars may talk about business value of IT, but there's historically been a lot of common themes about trying to understand value from IT investments, via complementarities between IT investments and various kinds of organizations like human capital or business process innovation, or the role of co-invention across economics, IS, and strategy. What I'm going to talk in particular about the value of combining different theoretical and research perspectives that inform the different streams of research by talking about some projects that I've worked on together that have involved a combination of folks from different areas of research. So one is a recent paper that Christina McElharn and I looked at, which is about the implications of IT investments for organizational structure, namely the implications of communication technology that changes boundaries of the firm and vertical integration. And one issue on this was we were looking more at transaction flows. So how IT investments change transaction flows within and between firms by looking at concurrent sales by a establishment internally and externally. And in line with the conversation that we're having today, I mean, this is a question that NIS has been of long interest going back to the 80s and even before, and a line of research that started in the 90s and has been going on since then. But the key interest was one of sort of asset ownership, and we were looking at transaction flows. And so this was kind of an example of an existing line of work that had taken one perspective, but by looking at transaction flows, we took ideas from strategy on plural governance. So this idea that firms often don't just do make or buy and do make and buy. And so this was, in some ways bringing a new perspective on an existing question that was of interest to both, multiple fields. Another research project along the same lines looked at the interest in both strategy and IS, and for that matter, economics on knowledge flows. And so we were looking at the role of knowledge flows in an online community and the implications for productivity. So specifically, we were interested in firms, participants in an enterprise software community started by SAP, and what impact engagement in those types of communities might have on productivity. And so we were interested in issues that I think will probably be common to many in the room, sort of the role of prior knowledge, the role of the types of knowledge, and kind of the interaction between those. And of course, this draws a lot on ideas from strategy on absorptive capacity. I think the sort of IS angle to this was the need for a deep knowledge of, or some knowledge of the institutional setting in which this was embedded. Namely, what are the problems of implementing enterprise software in particular, that in issues perhaps of the multiple types of knowledge that are often involved in implementing that, as well as what are the settings in which it's easier. And so that was one thing, sort of combining institutional knowledge from IS with theory from strategy in a setting where, quite frankly, it's quite difficult to measure knowledge flows. In business process innovation, we often don't have things like patent citations or citations from publications. And so this is an example of applying institutional knowledge from one setting with a theoretical framework from another field in an environment that was kind of historically challenging. The third and final example that I'm going to provide is a recent project with Ryu Chen and Natarajan Balasubramanian, where we were looking at how worker mobility affects adoption of new technology. So, in particular, could changes in local worker mobility influence the likelihood of adopting AI or machine learning? And so we were looking at changes to how changes to state level enforcements of non-compete agreements might influence likelihood of adopting AI. And this was really a framework that built quite directly on multiple fields. First, this idea that business process and co-invention that are required in the adoption of new technology often require firms to make investments in the human capital of workers that are in turn retained by workers. So the firms are making the investments, but the human capital is being accrued by the workers themselves. And of course, this raises the issues that the workers could go and just go elsewhere, right? And so it raises these kinds of risks create a potential cost that may decrease incentives to invest in new technology. So this like AI, and so this was sort of an approach that really relied on ideas from multiple areas. So I think I'm almost out of time. So just to kind of wrap things up, I was thinking, most of these remarks are about convergence within an area using ideas from IS and strategy and other fields, be it different theoretical perspectives or institutional knowledge plus plus theory. One thing I will say that I'm curious to hear about from the other folks on the panel. I think this perspective may work particularly well in this setting because the problems that the two groups of scholars are studying are quite similar. My sense is that there's other areas of research convergence where perhaps IS and strategy scholars are often working on common problems, but sometimes looking at different issues as well. So I'm curious to hear from other folks on the panel. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Chris. That's some provocative thoughts to start us off. So next, I'd like to invite Shane Greenstein to.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate giving the opportunity to talk and listen to the others. And thank you, Chris, for starting off. That was wonderful. I must admit, I thought the question I wanted to first focus on is how did we end up with multiple management research subfields overlapping? And I must admit, as I've become the old man of the field. This question made me quite sentimental. And I recall that when I was a graduate student, the two largest data sets in common use were the US Census of Manufacturing and the Patent Database. And my thesis advisor at the time, Tim Bresnahan, had the wild idea that you could go to trade associations for dentists and find out where all the dentists were in the United States. And then you suddenly you could put them in cities and you could figure out there'd only be one dentist for every small town. And as towns get larger, you got a second dentist and then a third and so on. And he had this insight that you could use data to answer old questions, which inspired me to do something that we still do today. Chris will recognize. And that was to go to an inventory of computing use and infer changes in that inventory, from the changes in inventory, what the sales had been to make that happen. Now, that was easy to do when it was mainframes because they were big and you could see a change. And from there, I would say rather generally, what has happened in the last 4 decades has been the emergence of a lot of scholars who find a data set and then ask the question, to what question is this data the answer? And the emergence of an enormous number of data sets has been one of the largest drivers of convergence between the fields of IS and strategy and economics, because we're all working off the same data sets. Having said that, I think the question then to be posed is, why didn't we all end up in the same place? Because we're all using the same data. And that leads me to the following answer. Why do we see convergence and yet not 100% convergence? So Chris's answer I completely agree with, which is partly, in some sense, it's a different of interest. But let me just list things, and then I'll be done. Why do we see convergence? We're using the same data sources. We're using the same statistical packages, incidentally. We're all using Stata and R and scraping with Python. The headwinds and tailwinds that describe the background sections of our papers are exactly the same. I have to say there's also no shortage of brilliant, ambitious researchers in these areas across U.S. universities. I mean this in a very long-term sense. At no point in human history, really, in human history, have there ever been so many people interested in this topic. It's kind of amazing. There's no shortage of questions. It's not prohibitively costly to learn the theoretical frameworks. Takes a little time. It's usually not prohibitively costly to learn the statistical frameworks, except for you'll forgive me for saying the staggered diff and diff, which I really am still continually angry at the people who invented that method. I knew that would get a laugh from everyone in the room. You've all been through this now, right? And yet, some inputs are rare, and that is why we've diverged. Why have we diverged? I've made a little list here. The precise questions differ. There seems to be actually a shortage of stories and narratives that go beyond simple tropes. I will say as a reviewer, there's still a shortage of precise statements of the contribution to existing knowledge from authors. Boy, just a precise statement. And then the forces for divergence are pretty strong. Probably the number one thing is editors and senior colleagues inherit a different set of research priorities and vocabulary, and they insist junior people use it. So that's just an institutional, it's institutional inertia, if you want to call it that. A second thing is that we are organized around departmental boundaries inside of our universities. And so the same kind of institutional inertia applies to promotion and tenure. That is a strong motivator. And then the third thing, and I really mean it's third, is that you're a better, we all have teaching assignments, and teaching is more effective if you have specialized knowledge. It is unfortunately the case, however, that quite often effective teaching is not rewarded. Or not rewarded very much. I think that's why I would put it third. So to summarize, why did we end up in the same place, but not exactly the same place? And the answer is because the inputs are the same, and there's a small divergence in some of the reward structures. So an implication of looking at things that way is, does that present new opportunities for researchers today? And I would say yes. First of all, in the last 20 years, just to say it plainly, there's been a generational change in how society, Western society, and most of Asian societies as well, and I believe, other parts of the world as well, it's been a massive change in how people allocate their time. It's again, unbelievable to see such a massive change. So much more time is spent online today than ever before in human history. And that has induced a massive, again, very huge change in supply of services and products. So there's no shortage of new phenomenon to study. Chris mentioned a few of them, like platforms. I don't think there's any shortage of co-invention studies to be done as well. And then as you look forward, I mean, I see two things on the horizon, and then I'll quit. They're the two most obvious ones. An enormous number of firms have started to systematically use data science as an input, and it has changed the way they make decisions, and it changes the services they offer. And similarly, a large number of firms have started to use artificial intelligence as an input into their decision making and into their services, and it changes what they offer. Both of those have induced an enormous amount of unmeasured activity, and any of the brilliance among many of the scholars everywhere to figure out how to measure things. That's a huge opportunity. It arises in both IS and strategy and economics, that same measurement opportunity. And so I don't see any shortage of convergence occurring in the future across all the fields, because they're going to, again, be working off the same data sets, the same phenomenon, and have the same interests in the new phenomenon. So that's my 10 minutes. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dane. I'm sure that will provoke a lot of questions, which we can group together and have some discussion later. Next presenter is going to be Tobias Kretschmer. If you'd like to share your slides. Wonderful. Over to you, Tobias.
Wonderful. Thanks very much. I was going to start completely differently, but then Shane mentioned that we're all using the same data set, and that sort of set me back about 24 years when Chris Forman and I were in the same session at ZEW, just when we had finished our PhDs or in the process of finishing our PhDs in economics. And we actually found out that we're both using the same data set. That was Hard Hanks, for those who are old enough to remember. And we were looking at sort of questions of the diffusion of technologies, and especially, of course, digital technologies. As it turns out, Chris went from economics into IS, and is now in that space and is crossing over to strategy every once in a while. I'm now in strategy, and I cross over into IS once in a while. So I think it's really a great example of how these things turn out. Now, I guess the general question of, does digital convergence lead to scholarly convergence? Both Chris and Shane have answered this in the same way that I would, which is by and large, yes. Let me give you some sort of meta musings on how I think about this. So I was asked to comment on my home field, or from the perspective of my home field. And that really made me wonder, what is my home field in the first place? And I kept on coming back to basically its strategy. But I've become quite experienced in borrowing from and lending to other disciplines and subfields. And I think those are really plenty. I mean, we can think of marketing, as I have a paper in marketing science on how websites react to the introduction of GDPR. Of course, once we talk about the big tech firms, there's legal issues, regulation, for example, that firms react differently to the introduction of certain regulations. Of course, economics, questions of market structure, dominance. If we think about platforms, we have to think about vertical relations, and of course IS, which I think to a very strong extent has been at the forefront of using micro-level data. And I think that's also something that we as strategy scholars can take a lot of inspiration from. So why is this useful from a research point of view? Strategy, thinking about it, are often big decisions, right? So they're the long-term commitment type decisions that have gone through a level of planning, if you wish, but they also, and especially in digital industries, have an effect on behavior at lower levels of aggregation. So just if a platform makes it harder for complementers to enter, so that's sort of raising entry barriers, if you wish, complementers will decide to withdraw, change their effort, and they will do this in heterogeneous ways. So in some sense, we're looking at the effect of a large firm or of a larger firm making decisions that will affect a whole bunch of smaller firms, which then takes us into the area of entrepreneurship. If a firm improves its targeting algorithm, which could be thought of as a strategy, a strategic decision, how do you position, how do you choose to target your consumers? Users will consume more or different content, which then becomes an IS or a marketing question, or uses a lot of concepts from IS and marketing. If GDPR introduces liability for third-party suppliers, data governance. So that's basically what GDPR did. Now, as a website operator, you were responsible for the kind of data that your tracking software, your external tracking, a third-party tracking software would collect. So that's a regulatory question. Then websites basically made the strategic choice to integrate vertically, i.e. use less trackers, or to choose large suppliers, in this case in particular Google, which again becomes a strategic question. Now, that's sort of at the content level. But what I think is really interesting is that even if we look at SMJ, if we look at strategy journals, or if we look at IS journals, lots of the questions that are being answered do get published in both of these journals. And I get a lot of inspiration from reading across different fields. So that leaves the question of why this actually does work for strategy, and why does it work especially for strategy in digital markets. So I think sort of philosophically, or kind of in terms of the research approach, digitization often triggers phenomenon-driven rather than theory-driven research, right? So we're all interested in a really interesting big phenomenon, right? The emergence of platforms, the change in positioning, the change in tracking software, or the ability to look more closely at user behavior. So there, different perspectives are actually helpful and not confusing, right? So you can approach a similar topic or a similar phenomenon from different theoretical perspectives. Different fields actually cover different units of observations. Marketing, of course, looks at consumers. Entrepreneurship looks at complementers. Strategy looks at the actions of platforms, or at the actions of platform owners. And of course, IS has been very strong in looking at transaction level data, and many firm strategies affect all of them. And it would almost seem incomplete if we just discarded parts of that overall space. Decisions affecting many actors also means that we should expect heterogeneous responses. And those heterogeneous responses will basically make up an aggregate effect. So if I go back to the raising of entry barriers, that might mean that we get not just less entrants, less complementers, but we also get a different composition of complementers. So, this is probably one of the most shown pictures on platforms. You've got a platform, you've got users and complementers, and they're connected in some ways. And the idea is to make transactions possible, right? Now, if we look at the user side, this will mean that we need to look at marketing theories, marketing questions, marketing methods. If we're interested in what complementers do, many of the complementers will try to innovate. They will, of course, be mostly entrepreneurial firms rather than large multi-product firms. So there's questions of entrepreneurship, questions of innovation. Once we look at the transaction level data, information systems really comes to the forefront, and we learn a lot about that. Once we think about the connection between users and platforms, that's a lot of pricing. There's a lot of sort of I/O questions that I guess constituted sort of the first wave of a lot of platform research coming from theoretical I/O. And of course, when it comes to the question of platforms and their relation to complementers, we're going to go into areas of organizations, of vertical integration, even organizational economics. And so I would argue, and this is not completely innocuous, but strategy being at the center of it all, we'll have to use some of those different approaches, some of those different theories and methods to give a fairly complete picture of what's going on with strategies on platforms or by platforms, and with the impact that it has on all sorts of different units of observation. So to sum up, I think there's plenty of potential to link strategy questions with methods or data or units of observations from other fields. I think digitization has brought these fields together because it's phenomenon-driven research, and because different entities are affected. And for strategy scholars, I think it's important to read more widely across disciplines and embrace sort of the heterogeneity in responses and also selection effect of strategic choices. And I want to sort of close by picking up on one point that Shane has mentioned, which is basically about the incentive structure of academia. And so if you're looking to get tenure, you want to get tenure in a particular department or in a particular field. I think that really means that it's upon the more senior scholars, or tenured scholars at least, to kind of build these bridges and make sure that once you're a bit freed up from the immediate incentive structures or the immediate pressures, then you can actually go on and do research that tries to bridge all of these aspects. So thanks very much, and look forward to the discussion.
Wonderful, thank you, Tobias. I would next like to invite Sofia Bapna. If you have some slides to share, you would be welcome to share those now, please.
Yes, I do have some slides. Thank you. Just give me a minute to pull them up. Here we go. Okay, is that visible to everybody?
Right now we see the presenter view, so you might need to click to switch that with the full screen view.
Okay, 1 second.
The switch display button might work there.
Okay, is that good?
And we don't see a screen share right now, so.
Okay, I'm going to try again. Share screen. Okay, is that good? Okay, thank you so much. And thank you, Florence and David, for inviting me to this panel. I'm going to start out with telling you a little bit about myself. So I have a PhD in strategic management and entrepreneurship. I graduated about a decade ago in 2016, and my dissertation was titled Entrepreneurship and Digital Communities, Harnessing Legitimacy and Resources. And as you can tell from the name of this dissertation, it bridges many disciplines. So there's the word entrepreneurship, so it's interesting to entrepreneurship scholars. Digital communities, interesting to IS scholars. Harnessing legitimacy, interesting to org theorists. And acquiring resources, is addressed by strategy scholars. So when I went on the job market, I was actually looking at jobs both in strategic management and entrepreneurship, as well as in IS. And it turned out that I decided to pursue a career in an IS department. Why I chose IS is a story for later, but that's where I am now, and I fully embrace that identity. So moving on from my dissertation, which was clearly interdisciplinary, I found that my research continued to bridge these different disciplines, and I have been publishing in papers in different fields. So when it comes to management science, I have publications in entrepreneurship, finance, and information systems desks. I also have a paper in the organizations desk of my management science. It's under review, so fingers crossed. And then I also have publications in the traditional IS journals, which include ISR and MISQ. So that's a little bit about me and my research. Now, switching to, is convergence happening? I do believe it's happening. And I'm going to start out with, why is this convergence happening? When I was a doctoral student, some of the big questions, and there are obviously many big questions, some of the big questions that interested me and which I pursued later. So when I was a doctoral student, some of these questions that we discussed in our seminars were, how can organizations, businesses, and entrepreneurs build legitimacy? How can they acquire resources? How can they acquire capital? And also, how can non-traditional entrepreneurs successfully acquire resources and capital? This includes women, user entrepreneurs, so these were the questions that I studied in the traditional strategic management and entrepreneurship department, right, in my seminars. And then when you think about the digital layer, the pervasive use of digital technologies such as social media, crowdsourcing, crowdfunding, these questions are playing out in online contexts. And this leads to a scholarly opportunity. That is, these research questions are now of interest to not just the strategy and entrepreneurship scholars, but also to the IS scholars. And it is an ideal time for interdisciplinary research, that is, co-author teams across disciplines. So what can stand in the way of this interdisciplinary research? The first is rigid scholarly boundaries. So if someone were to say to me, you are an IS scholar, and therefore you can only publish in ISR, MISQ, or not can, you should only be publishing in ISR, MISQ, or Management Science IS desk, then that would be problematic when it comes to interdisciplinary research. Also, I think Tobias touched upon this a little bit, institutional processes and tenure. So if I were to publish a paper, or if I have several publications in other disciplines, right, are they going to be counted towards my tenure or not, right? And this is not, people may say, yes, sure, they'll be counted. There's a list of 8 journals, but is it really going to be counted? What are my letter writers going to say about it? What is the department and what is the school going to say about those publications, right? These questions matter. And fortunately for me, I belong to an institution that actually embraces this interdisciplinary research. So what has this interdisciplinary research given me? In one word, it's allowed me to span boundaries, right? So I have a broader set of co-authors. I have co-authors in computer science, in HR, in strategy. I have a broader set of journals to which I can submit. Okay? I have the ability to have impact in different fields and also, talk to scholarship in these different fields. Access to funding. So my NSF grant includes 3 main faculty, that is me in IS, Russ, who is in strategic management, and Connie, who's in HR. And I think one of the key aspects of why we got this NSF funding was the interdisciplinary nature of our proposal. Okay. It also gives access to different audiences and perspectives, which makes the work richer, because these audiences view the work through different lenses, and also different literatures say different things about the same work, right? So very recently, I presented my work at the University of Minnesota Computer Science Department. I also presented my work at Michigan State in the Human Resources and Labor Relations Department. So these people brought different perspectives to my work, which I think was very valuable. Now, what is required for interdisciplinary work to occur? That is, the co-authors need to be at a place which values this interdisciplinary research. So I have a paper with Martin Ganko, who's at the University of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and we have a publication in MIS Quarterly. Now, if their institution didn't value in the strategy department a publication in MIS Quarterly, then that would be problematic, right? So, having co-authors who are in institutions that value this interdisciplinary research is important, and it's not a given. Okay? And it also involves a lot of work. So it involves networking with people in different disciplines, presenting at conferences in different fields, Okay, so now, obviously I go to my IS conferences, but if I want to also attend conferences in other fields, it means it's time. It's the time to travel, go there, spend time there. It's resources, which affect my research budget. And also, when you go to conferences in different fields, you may not know anybody there. Okay, and this can be intimidating, okay, because it's obviously more comfortable to go to conferences in your field where you know a bunch of people. And so this takes a whole effort in terms of time and energy. And the other thing that is required for interdisciplinary research is presenting at seminars in different fields. And when I do present at these seminars in different fields, I have to think about how can I present my work that is interesting to the folks in this field, right? And also do my homework on people there to connect my work with the work that they are doing. So again, this is a lot of work, right? Doing this interdisciplinary work, then presenting your research in these different departments. Okay? And also another aspect is having good relationship with your co-authors, as well as compromising. Okay, so I have co-authors who are, computer scientists, economists, sociologists, and also they reside in different departments. Now, working together with these people is non-trivial. We've had really heated discussions on many things, such as how results should be presented, right? How should we write? And again, what they brought to the papers is invaluable. So I would definitely have them on my papers, but on my research. But then there's also different norms and the need to compromise and listen to what the other people are saying, right? So again, non-trivial, right? If you're working with co-authors all in the same discipline, you all agree as to how things should be written, how things should be presented. And to me, when we had these heated discussions, I took it as everybody wanting the paper to look the best, which is why people had an opinion. Otherwise, they would simply agree. And so that's why, we had these heated discussions, which was why, I think our papers were stronger. And finally, in terms of publishing in different disciplines, it's obviously important to know that literature and the norms of writing in those fields. And I've found that having model papers, that is picking a model paper that one is trying to emulate, has worked really well for me. So those are my thoughts, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sofia. You have touched on some of the subjects we actually had questions about surfaced in the chat already, and that we can continue to address in some Q&A after our last panelist. So if I could invite Milan Miric at the University of Southern California. Would you like to share your slides? Wonderful, we see that. Okay, over to you, Milan.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much to the organizers. Thank you for having me on this, and appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts. I think very much a lot of the folks, what they've said is stuff that I've been thinking and stuff that I've been trying to present. But I think the way I wanted to start on this was to basically provide a bit of a definition about how I think some of these fields, kind of how you can think about them, because I think this often comes up as a challenge. Like, what is at the core of strategy? What is at the core of information systems? And then why might those two not always look the same? Why might the papers not look the same? And so a caveat is, of course, when I'm defining something, people may disagree with my definition. And so this is a generalization, but it's a generalization that's meant to be helpful. And so when we're thinking about information systems, I think a way you can think about a lot of the studies is the impact of something digital. So it's usually a technology, or almost always by definition of technology, on something else. And that something else can be firms, right? Kind of like often happens in strategy, but it can also be people, it can be society, it can be things happening in society. So there are studies looking at how, certain rideshare or Airbnb or things like this impact cities. And so that city, it's both the firms in that city, but also the people, entrepreneurship, all these different things. And there's studies with information systems that look at that. There's studies in information systems looking within companies, what happens as technologies diffuse, as technologies are kind of new technologies emerge, as those technologies are used also within your firm and within competing firms. So it's a broad bucket that often looks at the impact of some digital technology on either a societal organizational process. That digital technology can also be a policy relating to that technology. But I think in a broad bucket, the nature of the thing having an impact is some technology, and then what it's having an impact on can be anything. Strategy, I think, often focuses on a much more specific set of outcomes, which is thinking about these trade-offs. So not everything is always positive. In some cases, it can be positive. In some cases, it can be negative. And kind of understanding the consequences of these decisions. And at the center of that is often a firm. Not always. Sometimes it's an entrepreneur, but oftentimes it's a firm or it's a manager inside a company. And so even though those two things are very related, as I think many of the speakers have said, there is a bit of a tension. So some of these IS studies will focus on policies, societal outcomes, or an outcome of a specific firm. So thinking about like an Airbnb or an Uber or something, which is a firm, but it's a firm where, you know, it's very unique. And in some sense, the manager is often kind of a algorithm or something, right? So it's somewhat of an idiosyncratic setting, whereas many strategy papers, as you read them, often talk about really a prototypical firm or a manager, talking about a process that, even though it may be in a particular industry, would apply to many other industries. And so there's this tension and there's this difference, but I think there's an opportunity to balance both when writing a paper and being able to speak to both literatures rather than kind of doing neither. And those are some kind of things that I've noticed that I hope to kind of get across, at least from my own experience. So I want to talk about two examples of how I think about this in my own work. So I have a couple of studies where we study the diffusion of a disruptive technology. And so you can think of something that's, you know, by disruptive, I mean, it's replacing workers, replacing the way things are done. New processes are emerging. New skills are all of a sudden important and complementary, and how that happens within an industry. Now, there have obviously been various technologies that have had that effect, and we're seeing, you know, new technologies that do that now. But by looking at this specific context, hopefully we can learn something. And so there's two types of outcomes we can study. We can study what happens in terms of products that are generated with this new technology. How does the firm perform? Is the firm more productive? Is the firm less productive? Which firms are more productive? Which firms are less productive, right? And so there's ways that we can study product outcomes and firm outcomes, but we can also study what happens to the individual workers. So as people in a company are using this technology, their skills are changing, they're moving between companies, you know, certain workers are being replaced, certain workers are upskilling, all these other things are happening. And so this study, or this set of studies, is at the heart of both literatures in some sense, but they focus on slightly different things. If you look at this from an IS angle, you're really asking, what is the impact of this technology? Can we show, how did this new technology impact the products being created? How did it impact firms that adopted this technology? Did some firms benefit more than others? How did this technology impact workers? Workers, you know, did their productivity go up? Were they more likely to move? Were their skills more general? Were other workers being substituted? What happened to those workers that were substituted? That, you know, as demand for certain skills shift, what does that impact? So that's how I think a lot of these kind of IS papers, or from an IS lens, to think about this phenomenon. But underlying this, there's also a problem that's very interesting, the strategy, but I think in many ways can be framed differently than the issue above. So from a strategy lens, you might think about this as, if everybody in an industry is using the same technology, right? If I can call up Microsoft and buy the exact same thing the same way that you can, why is this a strategic issue? Why does this matter? Why does us having a technology that everybody can have access to matter to productivity, to performance, to mobility, to all these different things? It's in some sense a very generic asset. It's not something that we would strategically kind of, you know, build a company around, but yet it's something that seems to have this performance impact. And so part of what I think I've tried to do in some of these studies is to highlight that aspect. And I'll talk about that as I think part of the opportunity for how these two areas can converge. So I think technology is increasingly becoming central in strategy. I mean, I think this is part of why this convergence is happening. And I think Shane provided a really, I think you said as the headwinds of our papers, right? So there's a common set of phenomena that's driving a lot of what papers are trying to explain. And so in many ways, firm strategic decisions are increasingly tied to technology and IT choices in particular. So these decisions about calling up Microsoft or calling up Google or linking and choosing which type of technology you're going to use and make and how you're going to do all these things is increasingly important. And they're, if you're thinking about entrepreneurship, they're often some of the first decisions that companies make. If you're thinking about established companies, they're just companies that have important trade-offs. And so these are increasingly important decisions, but it might apply to different literatures. And so thinking about how to tie these two things together, to my point above, how to think about what is the impact of this technology, but then why is this having an impact when everybody has access to the same thing? And so this phenomenon might apply differently to different literatures. I think it's important. There are two things that I have in mind as I'm trying to study these things, is to think about how the insights are context specific. So I'm focusing on a specific technology. Let's understand what that impact of that technology was. But then also, how does this generalize? How does this apply to other technologies that we've seen in the past and we're seeing in the future? And I think similarly, thinking about the importance of the technology, so as this new thing that is changing processes, et cetera, but also why is this strategically important? And it's actually, it's often interesting when you start kind of thinking through why, for instance, if any of Microsoft can get access to a particular tool, or any of us can, integrate OpenAI in our processes, why is there that some firms are pursuing this, others aren't? Why are there differences in how effective they are? And these are all very interesting strategic questions that we can disentangle. So I think, to summarize, as technology is becoming more central to firm strategy, these issues are converging. And I think that there's opportunities to apply the same phenomenon to different literatures, but I think the different literatures often have a slightly different flavor in terms of what type of questions they're asking. And so I think it's important to be aware of both and to try to kind of link both and make sure that you're able to speak to both sets of issues, both able to speak to what is the impact of something, and also what are the trade-offs, what are the decisions associated with something. So that's it for me.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for your insights. So now we're going to open it up for discussions and questions. So first, I want to give the speakers a chance if you want to respond or ask questions to another speaker. You just unmute yourself, and otherwise I'll start with Deepak's question. Oh, Lucy. Oh, hey, Lucy, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Just now, we mentioned some phenomena such as like Uber, Airbnb, and is already at the city's level. So I'm thinking about, like, in addition to management information system, there are also some social scholars that study at the city level. For example, geographical information system, and that beyond the firm level. So in terms of integration, we just talk about integration among disciplines within the business school. But a lot of times when we think about sustainability of the firms, when the firms that interact with the city, which the community is that they don't operate according to the firm's logic, like the city, they have the community's logic, and then the other social disciplines, there are also some people just like the management information system, for example, geographical information system, that they study the city. So is there any possibility that when the phenomenon perspective that firms extend beyond the firm's boundary and go to the social domain, and then the logic is also beyond the firm's logic, traditional firm's logic, into the social domain, like sustainability of the community and environment? So how can we also integrate those social disciplines that the traditional study at the urban level that's beyond the firm's level?
Okay, so basically outside of the business school, who wants to start answering the question?
I can venture a response because I think it was partly driven by my comment. I think this is where some of the comments of the others about the constraints that the field or the journals or things that they may impose. And so I think if often, you can study the same phenomenon, but different fields will have different constraints. And so I think this, again, may be tied to funding, and may be tied to research, teaching, and maybe tied to language of a field. But I think, if you're looking at a lot of strategic journals, they're often interested in understanding things that are with firms or with managers or something at the core. And so if it's broader societal implications, I think about aligning that with managers might be one way to think about that. Or you might think about what is the area, what is the domain of research in which optimizing these things at a societal level is highly relevant. But I think you'll find often the field constraints there might push the paper in the direction where if you wanted to talk about how does this matter for the scale of a city, thinking about how does that discussion look in that literature might shape how you think about that phenomenon.
So maybe I chip in, but first of all, I really want to hear from Chris and Shane, given their, they started life as economic geographers in some ways. So I really think that you should give us your 2 cents on that. But I think generally, I mean, if what you basically mentioned is that so digital technologies or the behavior of firms might have spillovers into the larger society. So I think what would be interesting there is to actually look at how sort of the private incentives might differ from the societal benefits or costs, which actually takes us a lot into questions of, more broader questions of sustainability, where the behavior of individual firms may not really tie in with what we might want as a society. So I think that's where, if I were to think of a strategy angle for these kinds of questions, I would look at that wedge between private and public benefits.
Yeah, maybe I'll just chime in with a few remarks that relate to some of the other things that have been said earlier. So, I mean, to Shane's broad point, digitization is obviously, is influencing the same headwinds are not only affecting IS and strategy, but economics and many other social and other types of sciences as well. And so you're likely to see the same convergence across disciplines beyond the sort of scope of issues that we're talking about today. I also wanted to echo something that Milan said. I mean, I think the geographic unit of analysis, as a unit of analysis, may not always be aligned with strategy per se, but certainly in IS, there's a number of, there's a rich work on the effect of digital technologies on local geography, and similar as Tobias alluded to, Shane and I have done some work at the geographic level of analysis. I'll only say one thing at the strategy level. While the unit of analysis may not necessarily be at the county level or metro area or what have you, often firm decisions can, of course, be influenced by market level phenomenon that may operate at the geographic level. Local labor markets being a very good example, infrastructure being another. So those certainly do come into play as well, even if the unit of analysis per se isn't at the geographic level.
Yeah, I guess I'll pipe in. One of my favorite papers is with Chris and Avi Goldfarb, do cities substitute for internal firm resources? And we were reacting to the phenomenon we saw in our data, that firms located in major urban areas behaved one way and firms located in much smaller cities behaved a different way when it came to investing in frontier internet technologies. This is an observation from approximately 20 years ago. And, Sunny Tambe has written about this as well in software markets, that you find supply of labor frontier software coders differs by local labor markets. And it's just so happened that digital technologies have lent themselves to local services and local labor markets. And so the geographic framing of questions has been a very natural way to understand heterogeneity from experience. So that's partially what's taken us into geography. As Chris alluded to, so did infrastructure, because infrastructure is varies so much over geography, and it's a bigger topic almost from another day. I would add one thing just to this conversation. It's correct that once you start looking locally, as the questioner asked, it is correct. Once you start looking locally, you are naturally drawn to social conversations and social concerns, and that becomes one lens through which to look at local activity. I would like to pipe in and say there is another lens, and certainly in my experience has been the most compelling lens, and that's policy. That every single city has a mayor and has a congressional representative and has a state governor, and they all want to be prosperous. And so if you, as an academic, you are able to make an insight into why the local environment supports or does not support local growth, man, you just have the most compelling question ever, and other academics will give it to you. We'll concede the point immediately. So I have found throughout my career, though I find lots of things interesting, I am continually drawn to, when it comes to geographic, and this is very true with the work that Chris, Avi, and I did together, to questions that naturally you could present in front of the Federal Communications Commission, or you could naturally present in front of a state development board, because they wanted to know why was some cities growing and others weren't, and what could they do to change that. It was just, that has always been, front and center, a compelling question. So just one other remark. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so we can't have a talk without an AI question. So questions from the audience. So what would be new promising areas for quantitative research using new technologies, including AI, and thinking here maybe more at the industry or firm level? So, and again, maybe you to, stay in the team, do you think that AI is going to reinforce that convergence or collaborations between our fields? I'm sure you're being asked that question a lot. Everybody wants to know what's happening with the AI.
All right, I'll go for it. Chris knows exactly what I'm going to say. We are in an early moment of the deployment of a major technology. Good Lord, does this remind me of 1996, 97, and the deployment of the internet. The most compelling question, as far as I'm concerned, is what do firms have to invent in their complementary business processes in order to turn the new technology into something that is valuable? And to put it in the most simple framing, here we have a new technology. Firms do not just adopt technology; they invest in complementary things. They invent complementary processes. It's not often that those complements are already there. They then do it with a purpose. It's to implement something new or to improve something they're already doing. And that framing, as that's Chris Forman's thesis. That's where we are today in AI. And boy, that seems like an enormous agenda. So that's just kind of the easiest thing for me to say. But I'm sure others have different.
I others want to react? No, we can also connect that to the complementars from Tobias graphic. We possibly new complementars using AI. Okay, should we take one last question? Let me see.
So I guess for the one question that was raised by Deepak and Florence yourself was about collaboration across boundaries. So any practical advice for co-authoring relationships across boundaries, or deciding on journal tactics and framings across boundaries?
So I'd like to share some thoughts on that with respect to co-authoring and deciding on journals. So I think the big question that I get asked, by faculty as well as my reviewers often is that, so recently I had a submission to ISR, and they said, R1 comment number 1 said, why is this IS research, right? Why not a different field? And as long as you can make the case that there is something about information systems that makes the answer to the question different. So in this particular case, it was about, are user entrepreneurs more likely to be successful when they raise capital through equity crowdfunding relative to producer entrepreneurs? And traditionally, user entrepreneurs have had difficulty, raising capital through angels and venture capitalists. So is there something different about the context of equity crowdfunding that would potentially give us a different answer, right? As long as you can make the case for that, then it fits into an IS journal. So here, basically my point was that the types of people who contribute through equity crowdfunding are very different from angels and venture capitalists, and thus we are likely to see different responses to these pitches by user entrepreneurs. So in choosing which journal it goes to, I think it's important to know whether there's a contribution to that particular field or not. But there's something unique about the digital technology that'll give us a different answer, then it fits into an IS journal.
Thanks, Sofia.
I think I want to probably give a very pragmatic answer, which is basically I would send the paper where I think it basically interests the most people. And I mean, that's in some sense, speaking from the comfort of a tenured position. But at that point, if you do that, really what you most care about, I think, is impact. And it doesn't matter so much if it's yet another strategy paper, yet another IS paper or marketing or whatever. I think really at that point you want to write papers that you're excited about, and then basically look at at where the audience would be most receptive. And I've started many papers that I thought were going to go into SMJ, and they ended up in marketing science or in ISR. And I think that journey will be partly driven by the empirical results, partly by the best story you can tell with the results that you have. And I think that's where I tend to let my papers go in the direction where I think they'll be best read.
Great. Thank you, Tobias.
Thank you. I think we covered most of the question. David, are you happy with the?
I'm very happy. I'd just like to thank once again all of our wonderful panelists. Very thought-provoking ideas. There's clearly some convergence happening. There's clearly an interesting question about why there's still separation. And I think one thing that this has led me to think about is, are the two fields now, they've become sufficiently close together that maybe they're at an optimal point for even more recombination of ideas. They're not too far apart, they're not too overlapping, but it might be at a sort of sweet spot where there's some good cross-fertilization to happen between the two fields.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. And hopefully see you at the next STR online event. And if not, see you in Copenhagen in person.